Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. As the rising threat of Islamic militants has garnered the focus of the international community in its battle against the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant in Syria and Iraq, Israel has voiced concern regarding signs of easing the pressure against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Even though the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, published a report in early September voicing concerns regarding Tehran's failure to answer questions by an August 25 deadline in what the UN agency describes as the possible military dimensions of the country's nuclear program. With us today in the studio are to discuss this topic Dr. Emily Labndau, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies and director of the Arms Control and Regional Security Project. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome Dr. Elisheva Maklis, if I say it correctly, Maklis, all right, an expert on Middle Eastern and Iranian studies from the Tel Aviv University and researcher for the Center of Iranian Studies. Welcome. And I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mati Shoshani.
It's good to be here.
It's always a pleasure to have you. And I'd like to start with a question to you, Dr. Labndau, with regard to the aspects of this Iranian negotiations that are happening at the moment. We had it also on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, as well as in a few days or a week there's going to be other talks in Europe. How do you see this going on right now?
Well, not very well, unfortunately. The process is, at this stage, not looking good. We passed the July 20th deadline. There were 6 months within which the P5+1 and Iran were supposed to arrive at a comprehensive deal for this ongoing nuclear crisis. Deadline came and went. They weren't able to reach a deal. There was an agreement for an extension of another 4 months of these negotiations. The deadline now is the 24th of November. That's very close. It's 2 months away. The first 2 months after the decision on the extension were not used too efficiently. August, vacation, September, it took some time, and only towards the end of September did they start gearing up again for negotiations. All the meetings on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly have not produced anything. Basically, this is what we hear from almost all the diplomats involved. I think maybe the U.S. negotiator, chief negotiator, said that there was some progress, but from all other directions, we heard basically no progress. Over the past 8 months, we've heard from Iran basically a message of no, no, no. No stopping uranium enrichment, no dismantlement of centrifuges, no closing of Fordow or other nuclear installations, no talk of their missile capability, no talk of weaponization, the famous PMDs, the possible military dimensions, and of course they missed the August 25th deadline, as you said in your opening remarks. So we're basically at a point where there are no indications that Iran is moving anywhere near the demands of the international community. There's 2 months more for this next deadline, which might turn into another deadline. They could conceivably extend the negotiations. It's allowed under the terms of the interim deal. We'll have to see what happens. It'll be more difficult to get another extension because it'll start looking like this negotiation isn't going anywhere. But we know that both sides don't really want to proclaim negotiations to have failed, and that's why they're continuing.
Dr. Maklis, would you agree with that? And also, Hassan Rouhani, the Iranian president, reiterated in almost every speech he has that Iran reserves the right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. How do you see or perceive the Iranian prospect towards this situation?
Well, we have to understand that Iran is, of course, an Islamic state, an Islamic republic, but it also has very strong national aspirations, and we could view the whole nuclear issue in regards to this more, I would say, national aspirations and regional aspirations. It's interested in being a regional power, and therefore nuclear is very significant for it. It sees this as part of its national pride, and therefore I think Iran will insist on continuing the process of development, and I don't see a case in which it's going to forego this nuclear ability.
Mattia, I'd like to hear your comment on this and also add a question. We can see a lot of Iranian aspirations towards this nuclear or its alleged nuclear weapon aspirations or its peaceful aspirations. Do you believe that in light of the various events occurring at the moment in the world with various sanctions imposed on Russia, cutting Europe from a lot of oil and gas, that there's going to be some kind of shift towards Iran with regard to the imposed sanctions?
I think this is a very difficult situation, and I'll explain what I mean. We often talk on this show about how the public's bandwidth to deal with topics is limited, and everyone for a while talked about Iran, and then they forgot about it because we're busy with other terrorists in the area. But Iran didn't forget about this, and they have no reason as a country to, throw down their huge, we're talking years of investment, and they've been talking about. You mentioned, national aspirations. They've been talking about this since the Islamic Revolution. They're not planning to leave it, and if years of embargo, of financial, crippling steps that were made against their country didn't affect them, then how are a few negotiations with, in UN halls going to change anything? I don't think anyone actually expected this to change. In reality, people are just stalling because no one was willing to make the commitment of doing something practical to stop them, which would require military or very severe steps to stop them. So it's always a question of, what's really happening there internally, but at the same time, does the West even have the energy, an incentive to really stop them? Does someone want to go to war in Iran? I don't think so at the moment.
Dr. Labndau, your comment on the same question. Do you believe, as we heard just recently, the British Prime Minister talking about renewing relations with Iran in light of course, the crisis in Ukraine, which affects, if I'm not mistaken, Britain the most. Do you believe there is some kind of understanding here that Europe is moving towards easing sanctions in one way or another?
Well, we see indications of that. I think it's very, very unfortunate. The P5+1, which includes important European states, is involved in a very tough bargain with Iran over the nuclear issue. This is a major, major international security crisis that's been going on for 11 years. Other issues have come on the table, and of course ISIS is the most recent, and attention span tends to be limited and to move where the crisis seemed to be. But I think everyone needs to keep in mind that the scenario of a nuclear Iran, and I'm talking about an Iran with a weapons capability, is a terrible, terrible scenario for the Middle East. Iran's ambitions for this region are not positive for most states in the region.
Sense,
the
though,
implications will not be.
Or?
Well, first of all, there's implications in many directions. It's a global security issue, I should say, first and foremost. I mean, we in the Middle East are going to bear the brunt of the implications, but we can't forget it's a global security issue. And for this, I think the Europeans should actually be, most determined to deal with this, because it's a nuclear nonproliferation issue. Iran is a member of the NPT. They've been violating the terms of the NPT. You're very careful to say the alleged weaponization activities, but the truth is that it's the assessment almost across the board that Iran has been working for decades on a military nuclear program. There's a question of how active it is right now, but even if we take the famous National Intelligence estimate, the U.S. estimate from 2007, where they said that there's indications that Iran probably stopped the military work in 2009, 2003. Well, that means they were working on it up until 2003, which would be almost 20 years. So that in and of itself is a clear and blatant violation of the NPT. So there's an international norm here of nuclear nonproliferation that Iran is violating. It's a global security issue. And for the Middle East, of course, Israel is concerned, but many states in the region are very concerned. There's a proliferation concern. Saudi Arabia would probably go in that direction very quickly after Iran. So we need to keep in mind the implications here are very, very serious. This is not some small issue, you know, well, Iran needs it for national pride. No, Iran has real sinister regional designs for the Middle East. They don't see it through rosy glasses where, you know, we'll all have our place in a harmonious Middle East. They see it more in the sense of this will be the beginning of their attempts to try to really increase their influence over states in the region. Remember how they accepted the revolution or the change with the so-called Arab Spring in Egypt. It was well welcomed to the Islamic Revolution. That's what they would like to see across the Middle East. I'm not saying that they're going to succeed in this, but this is their ambition, this is their aim. A nuclear weapons capability would very much enhance their ability to start, slowly trying to advance those goals.
Dr. Maklis, would you agree with that? And then I would like also to ask you the same question. We hear more and more Iranian leaders, including President Hassan Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif, talking about how easing of sanctions and getting an agreement would create some kind of regional stability in the sense that Iran will be able also to join the international coalition against various Islamist organizations. How do you see that?
Well, I think we actually have a good opportunity to actually negotiate now with Iran and actually perhaps include Iran within some kind of more rational international community. Because I think Iran, just like any other country, has interests, and we have to find the political interests of Iran. And I think we now have special circumstances in which, first of all, we have a centrist president in power, Rouhani. We have a situation in which the diverse factions in Iran, and I'm talking about reformists, I'm talking about centrists, and the more radical forces, all support nuclear development. So there's a consensus on that issue. But on the other hand, we have the centrist forces that are also supporting negotiations with the West. So I think we shouldn't actually slam the door towards these negotiations. We should encourage Iran to find some kind of interests, if it's trade interests, if it's economic interests through easing of sanctions, perhaps including Iran somehow within some kind of coalition against the Islamic State, perhaps parallel to the Western coalition. So we have to find Iran's interest, and we have to find a way actually of...
In return for what? For what would be acceptable by the international community, by the West, to get to that point?
I think we have to continue negotiations. The question is, first of all, a question of goodwill. The question of goodwill means we accept Iran as a rational player. We accept Iran as a country that perhaps would like to develop nuclear, but perhaps we can transform the nuclear more for civil purposes. We have to find, I think, the right framework. We have to find the right way of being more inclusive of Iran and actually not pushing Iran to the corner, because I think we have a specific opportunity now, both with the rise of this centrist government in Iran, and of course we have the threat of ISIS, which threatens the borders of Iran as well.
Mati, just for the sake of the viewers also, the P5+1 is the United States, Russia, China, France, Britain, and Germany, and I would like to hear your comment on what has been said here, also in light of the ongoing negotiations and, as Dr. Landau also said at the beginning, not going anywhere with it.
Let me just, in relation to what you're asking, pick up on what Dr. Maklis said. You keep, I think, making a very liberal use of the word rationale, and I'll, for the sake of our viewers, I'll explain what I'm saying. Viewing Iran as a rational player, it seems to have been a very big mistake, and I'll explain. The result of the Islamist revolution in Iran has been, one, financial regression, generations of financial regression. They're facing a demographic bomb in the nation where natural growth or the growth of their population is at a negative, competing with Scandinavian countries. So their government is not, maybe the people might be rational in their decisions. The government, after almost 2 generations of Muslim rulership, is not in a position to make rational decisions. They have forced a very powerful agenda saying we're going to become a superpower in our region. That has failed financially, it's failed on the military level, and they have to make a decision. So when we're talking about the negotiations, they're pulling time. It's
If I could just clarify that point regarding being a rational player, I would like to provide 2 examples for that. If we go back even to Khomeini's era, we could see that he was a rational player, of course, according to their own interests. One example, you mentioned, the growing population. There was actually a fatwa, there was actually a religious edict coming out of Khomeini himself that said we should try to have a population that's less, and he actually allowed this from a religious perspective because of the demographic problem in Iran, which
that's
could have been seen
of very high growth.
Okay, but I'm just saying, for the interest of Iran, he retreated from the early assumption in which we have to have more and more children for the revolution because he understood there's a demographic problem. That's one issue. Syria, the alliance between Syria and the Islamic Republic, which continues, of course, until today, is not based on a religious factor. This is a strategic alliance. This is a political alliance. We know, of course, that the Ba'ath regime is based on the Alawite sect. This is a sect that to many are not even considered Muslim. So this is the basis of a relationship that continues until today, which is a rational relations, a strategic relations. And I think a country, even a country like the Islamic Republic, has its rationality, its own rationality, and you have to understand that, the interests of Iran.
Dr. Landau?
Well, not a little bit problematic, though, the alliance with Syria, when 200,000 people have been killed in Syria. It could be a rational strategic decision, but I think it's a terrible one, and it doesn't play to Iran's benefit as a player in this region. But I would say, we can have endless discussions about rationality. Is Iran rational? Is it not? I would say, as far as the nuclear negotiations are concerned, I have found, and I've studied in depth the negotiations from 2003. Iran is a rational player. What does rational mean? They do a cost-benefit analysis, and they are doing a very clear cost-benefit analysis. It's very clear how they're playing the game, but we can't make the mistake between rational and reasonable. Yes, rational, but not reasonable, not nice, with no good scenarios for the Middle East. And their rationality actually is something that could be leveraged by the P5+1. Let's not forget, over the course of 2012, very good, important, biting sanctions were put in place. That's what gave them the leverage for the negotiation that began in October 2013. Rouhani was elected partly because of the difficulties that they were experiencing internally because of the sanctions. Rouhani is there in order to get a deal which will mean minimal nuclear concessions and maximum sanctions relief. That's Iran's game. It's a very rational game, but the P5+1 needs to use the leverage that they still have in order to make sure that their agenda is the one that is the agenda that finds expression in the final deal. It is a tough bargain, and we can't forget this. It's not a game of confidence building. It's not two sides moving to a shared goal. Iran has no interest in an agreement.
Well,
they will only do it if they feel that they have no choice.
At the same time, we also hear a lot of players within the P5+1 asserting how these sanctions will not be moved and will not be lifted unless this agreement will be made.
That's important leverage.
Do you think that is the reason, though, that Hassan Rouhani, the Iranian president, is all the time vocally stressing the mutual respect issue within this negotiations?
The mutual respect issue as connected to the sanctions issue?
As connection to the ongoing negotiations, which is viewed by Iran as a major stallment.
I have to say I don't see too much mutual respect, and the lack of respect, I have to say, frankly, is Iran does not respect the United States. I can give you numerous examples over the past year how Iran has, you know, I don't know how to express it, but metaphorically slapped the face of the United States. I'll give one example. 3 days or 2 or 3 days after the July 20th, you know, initiation of the comprehensive negotiations started, Zarif was in Lebanon, the foreign minister, and he visited and put a wreath on the grave of arch-terrorist Morania, who is responsible for the death of several hundred American servicemen in Lebanon in the 1980s. That's a symbolic act that is really like a slap in the face of the United States. The United States didn't even really respond to that. The United States is showing a lot of respect to Iran. Where we don't see respect is the other way. And I think, unfortunately, the respect that the Americans and the P5+1 are showing Iran is really, unfortunately, translated into weakness in Iran's eyes. And it enables them to exploit the negotiations dynamic in their favor.
Dr. Maklis, would you believe, or do you believe, that there is a chance to build enough confidence on both sides in order to reach an agreement?
Well, I think now that we have this new factor of the Islamic State, I think it puts everything in a new light, because as we see the news and we see the focus now of the international community, the focus of the international community is over this threat, which is in Iraq, of course, in Syria, but even has broader reach in the entire Middle East. So I think due to that issue, from the Western perspective, I think this will be more of a desire, actually, to reach some kind of agreement with Iran. And from the Iranian perspective, I think they also have a very big incentive to reach an agreement, I would say more from the economic perspective. When Rouhani rose to power, he promised his people that he's going to remove the sanctions. There's a very dire economic situation, particularly the middle class suffers from it, but also the lower classes, and he has to deliver on the economic front. So I think we have, from the Western perspective, we have the Islamic State, which is perhaps pushing towards a deal with Iran vis-a-vis the nuclear issue, and from the Iranian perspective, they have the economic situation and removal of sanctions, which is very important for Rouhani.
Mati, with regard to the pressure on Iran at the moment, do you believe that the pressure that we could sense at the beginning of the negotiations is still valid for now, a few months after this negotiations process?
I think, like was said here correctly, the situation is quite complicated. The West is very adamant about not allowing Iran to have military capability. And at the same time, Iran is quite set on reaching that capability. And there isn't a middle ground that people can agree on. So it would, gambling on this would be a very dangerous bet. But they're still quite clear. I don't think anyone in the West is interested in seeing Iran with a nuclear capability. At the same time, Iran, they're not going to let go easily. So we or tighten the noose, or the West tightens the noose on Iran, or we wait it out long enough for it to make it almost impossible for them to continue, and they'll just have to give somewhere. Postpone it, whatever, will be shut down. So even if it's just for the appearance of it, someone's going to have to give on one of the ends.
Dr. Labndau, with regard to Israel, I'd like to move towards this aspect. Netanyahu was very adamant at his UN General Assembly speech, in which he tried and refocus the world's attention towards the Iranian threat. Do you believe that Israel is a key player in these negotiations when it comes to what's going on, or are they at the moment just a sideline watcher, if you will, who is trying to make the big players listen?
That's a very important and very difficult question. If I may, I just want one comment on the ISIS issue.
We don't have much
I'll be
time,
very
so
short.
very brief.
We've seen how Iran is leveraging that. They're now saying for our cooperation on fighting ISIS,
True.
we want nuclear concessions. Keep that in mind. ISIS cannot be at the expense of dealing with the nuclear crisis. As far as Israel is concerned, Israel is not really a player. It's not Israel's role or responsibility to deal with Iran. As I said at the start, this is an international security issue. It goes back to the NPT. That's an international arms control treaty. The responsibility is squarely on the shoulders of the Security Council to deal with Iran's violations. Israel has, put itself more at the forefront just because we are the target of horrific rhetoric that comes from Iran. And I'll just mention that in the latest round of fighting in Gaza, we heard very clearly, not mincing words anymore from Khamenei, he said very clearly that the solution to fighting in Gaza is the annihilation of Israel. So when you face that kind of rhetoric, it sort of pushes Israel more to the forefront. During the Gaza war, Israel also ignored this issue. Now Netanyahu is coming back, trying to remind the world, keep your eye on Iran.
Dr. Maklis, same topic. My question here, though, is with regard to the Iranian perspective of Israel, as we hear that the rhetoric is quite strong regarding the so-called Zionist enemy in their perspective. Do you believe that these negotiations and Israel's vocality will raise some kind of action from Iran?
Well, we don't see any change in Iran's position vis-a-vis Israel. I mean, we do see the centrist government, the centrist political leader, but his centrism is more about culture issues. It's more about how they run internally, how they run the Islamic Republic, and not the way they perceive Israel. I don't see any change in the rhetoric coming out of the Islamic Republic regarding Israel. And I totally agree with what was said here, that this is not our war to fight. This is not the war of Israel. Israel should leave this for the international community to negotiate regarding the nuclear issue. But as well, I think also the question of ISIS, which comes into play here as well, is another very significant threat to the region and to all players, including Israel. But this should be left, I think, to the international community.
In 2 sentences, what do you believe will happen in the near future?
Regarding?
The negotiations?
Well, I believe they'll go forward. I believe there will be many concessions from the Western side vis-a-vis Iran, because of this sense that the real enemy now is perhaps the Islamic State and not Iran. So I believe there will be more concessions. The West will be willing to give a lot more to Iran in this aspect.
Dr. Landau, 1.5 sentences?
Hopefully that won't happen, but it looks like we're moving towards a bad nuclear deal, unfortunately.
Well, hopefully there's not going to be a deal if it's going to result in a bad one. Thank you so much, Dr. Maklis, for coming here. Thank you, Dr. Landau. It's been a pleasure. I'd like to thank you also, Mati. It's always a pleasure with you at the program. And I'd like to thank our viewers at home, and we will see you next time.